Welcome. This is our panel on the craft and process of book-length projects with Pioneer Valley Writers Workshop's Manuscript Program instructors. So my name is Joy Baglio. I'm the founder and director of Pioneer Valley Writers Workshop. And if you're new to what we are a literary arts organization that hosts a seasonal lineup of writing workshops, changes every season. And our classes are all virtual. We hold readings, panels, and a monthly community writing on the first Friday of every month that is free and open to everyone. The writers featured today are all instructors in our 10-month manuscript program, which recently opened for applications now through December 21st. And it's a program for writers in any genre who want to be part of a small, supportive, and structured group as they work toward completion of a book-length manuscript. So if you're interested in learning more about the program, you can visit pioneervalleywriters.com or .org. And we have a program page that goes through all the aspects of that program. You can also subscribe on our website for regular updates on workshops and the other events and programs we host. We also have a virtual open house that is coming up where we'll talk more in depth about that program, and each instructor in the program will also talk about their particular section. So you can RSVP for that open house on our website also under events. So today, what our program looks like is we'll start with short readings from each of the panelists who will share from their in-progress book-length work. Actually, I'm not sure if it's all in progress. We'll share from their book-length work. Then we'll dive into discussion on the craft, process, challenges, and anything else we can share that is helpful about long-form writing projects and book-length work. So let me start by introducing our first panelist and reader. So Dorian Fox leads the Memoir Workshop in PVWW's 10-month manuscript program. His essays, articles, and stories have appeared in a wide range of literary publications, including Brevity, the Rumpus, Gay Magazine, Atticus Review, Under the Gum Tree, McSweeney's Internet Tendency, Creative Nonfiction's Sunday Short Reads, among others. His work has also been honored in various competitions and received nominations for the Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net. A longtime Massachusetts resident, he now lives in Brighton, Massachusetts. Welcome, Dorian.
Thanks, Joy. And hello, everyone. Thanks for being here today. So I'm just going to read a short excerpt sort of a fragment, I guess. And I guess the only thing you need to know going into it is that the jumping off point for this piece is a memory of sitting on a ski lift. I can't see him there, but I know we would have worn our thermal jackets, mine blue and green, my dad's a bright tangerine shade that embarrassed me, with a matching black and orange headband, his dark hair sticking out on top. It was the mid-90s, the boom years, sunny and cold, near spring melt. I was maybe 14. Down below, next to the lodge and the outdoor sausage pit, a contest was unfolding. Skiers in wild get-ups, spandex, cowboy hats, their boas, shot up a ramp emblazoned with a logo and glided onto a pool of water, skimming across until they lost speed and sagged back, splashing down as the crowd hooted and laughed. No one reached the far side. The game was designed for them to fall. I kept thinking one might make it. I can see so much else from that day on the lift, but for some reason, not my father. It's likely he was there, beside me, probably, but if not, somewhere close by, in the lodge with my mom and a beer, gliding down a trail off the intermediate slope. From decades away, I try to swivel my head to check the seat next to me, but it won't move. We skied together often during a stretch that corresponded roughly with my middle adolescence, before I asked for a snowboard and got one, and then gave up on winter sports altogether, distracted by college, jobs, love. It's been 25 years since I clicked into a pair of skis, and probably about the same for him. Now, a ski weekend would be an extravagance for me. For his part, I think he's just too tired, retirement verging, busy lobbing spirals to my sister's kids. I can't imagine skiing without him back then, or now. Big speakers pumped out grunge rock, songs I liked by young men with long hair and torn clothes. This was when I believed media consumption could be rebellion, when I thought annual ski passes for the whole family and a corporate-owned cabin with a pond were normal, perks to be counted on. It was before my dad left his position for a higher one with another company and lost that job unexpectedly and took it hard, the fallen provider, staring numb from his blue recliner like it was carved from ice. Before I graduated into a recession and worked a string of wage jobs, surviving in the city with his help for years. Before we sat by the backyard fire around 4th of July, half drunk on his beer, sparkler ashes in the driveway, and he said, "I feel for you kids. It was different for us." Even though I was then in my 30s, not a kid at all, from the look of it. He was with me another time during those ski years. Fresh off our drive from the suburbs, I fastened my skis and launched into my first run, carving downhill toward the bottom and a bare patch of grass that I swear I saw another skier slide over with ease. When I hit it, my skis stuck and I crumpled, flipping legs overhead. 2 older boys perched on a snowbank cracked up laughing. My dad must have seen the wipeout, but he swooshed past me, maybe thinking I was fine, maybe hearing the laughter. When I caught up, pink-faced and breathless, he told me I should have used my poles to vault hop over the grass like the first skier had apparently done, and I felt his concern spinning into blame, and I wanted to ask why he didn't stop to check if I was all right. But I just shrugged and stood there scraping slush out of my collar. I wonder if these are the chief currencies among fathers and sons, need and shame. I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you so much, Dorian. What a line to leave us on. That's so, I love it. Next up, we have Kate Senecal. Kate Senecal is the director of our 10-month manuscript program and also leads the novel writing workshops in the program. She holds an MFA from Vermont College of Fine Arts and is the former fiction editor of StoryCorps. Kate has received an honorable mention in Glimmer Train's 2019 short fiction contest and was the winner of Dogwood, a Journal of Poetry and Prose's 2020 award in fiction. Her fiction has been published in the Laurel Review, the Foundling Review, StoryCorps, the Water Wheel Review, and Dogwood. She's at work on a novel. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much. It's so fun to be here. This is a really short excerpt from my novel In Progress, and I don't think you need any context to get oriented, so I'll just roll right in. He walked right past Laurel as if he didn't see her. Adult Charlie moved with a sturdy man gait, thick and tall legs, striding with confidence as if each step could trigger the parting of the sea. He'd always moved like this, but when they were in high school, it seemed strange because he was so slight and had such tentative features and thin skin. Laurel wasn't sure what she'd expected. Did she think that seeing her in this all black, bought on clearance at Target outfit, standing with slumped shoulders within 5 feet of his pregnant sea nymph of a wife would rouse him so forcefully that he would run to her, put his hands on her face and tell her that she was the reason he moved back to town, that after 20 years, he thought of nothing but the day he could finish what he might have started that one night in high school. Laurel knew that if a universe existed in which that was the reality, that universe was not the one she was living in. It had happened in late August, the summer after their senior year of high school. They were at a party at Dawn's. Laurel remembered the moon was full and it clung to the palpable humid air, gluing together clusters of fireflies. The night sounds, the soppy vodka-laced teenage voices hovered in the middle like a swarm of sticky sound. And after Laurel took 2 hits off of the joint Becky passed around, she felt like maybe if she lifted her feet up, the thick summer air might just pick her up, carry her like a homecoming queen right into Charlie's lap. It did not, but somehow she ended up sitting next to where he sat, legs splayed on the grass, looking stoned and bored while the others tossed around a football, played flip cup. Laurel sighed and leaned back on her elbows, and then Charlie's face, was so close to her ear she could feel the heat, the wetness of his breath, the almost bristling of some stubble. "Want to get out of here?" he said. She looked up at him, confused, and when he sprung up from the ground facing the woods at the edge of the yard and motioned for her to follow, she did. They sprinted through the woods, heavy breathing, the thumping of feet dizzying. She watched Charlie's calves lift and fall until they made it to the edge of the large pond at the base of the mountain. Charlie stripped quickly, and after throwing his clothes to the ground, he ran into the water and broke out into a swim before Laurel even had her shirt off. The water was cool and it stilled her breath. She went underneath, and with the shelter of the pond just above her head, she collected herself. Above the water again, Charlie splashed her, a wide cascading wave of water he used the length of his whole arm to achieve. And then for hours beneath the summer Berkshire sky, so perfectly bespeckled with stars it looked like a painting, they played this way, like children. Charlie did handstands, lifting her with both hands under her armpits and tossed her into the hungry mouth of the pond. Eventually, more sober and exhausted, they waded out and grabbed for their clothes and then sat on the shore and watched the moon, so big it trembled on top of the trees. "I had no idea you were so fun," he told her. She buried her toes in the mud and made a noise that was almost a laugh. "I don't know, tonight I'm fun. I always thought maybe you didn't give yourself enough credit. I'm not sure why you hang out with Don and all those guys." Laurel shrugged. "Same reason you do. Not everybody can be special and weird like you, Charlie." Then he leaned back on his elbows. "Nah, that's the thing. I think you are. This town, everyone's the same. Maybe it's dumb to say, but you always seem different to me." "No, that's not a stupid thing to say," she tried, but she felt weirdly choked up, lit up. "Anyway," he said, "it's too bad we didn't do this sooner." Then Charlie's shoulders was wet against her bicep, and he pressed his mouth just below her ear into the space just under her jawline, and she leaned into a forceful ripple-type feeling she would spend the duration of her adult life trying to hunt down, the full-body throttle of teenage love. But Charlie pulled away, moved back to his position, and they talked until close to sunrise, like old friends. And for years, Laurel couldn't for the life of her remember a word they said or even how they got home. By morning, he had vanished, sucked up by the portal that is New York City, never to return even a single one of her text messages, and she fell into marriage, into motherhood, always returning in her memory to the steep fall of Charlie's mouth pressed over the skin where her pulse flickered, persistent like a steady, determined parade.
Thank you so much, Kate. Wow, I love how you ended that too with that section and whisk us quickly through time. So cool. All right, so our final reader before we get into our discussion, Carolyn Zaikowski teaches in PVWW's Manuscript Program, leading both the Nonfiction Workshop and the Poetry Hybrid Workshop. She writes across all genres and is the author of the hybrid novels In a Dream, I Dance by Myself and I Collapse from Civil Coping Mechanisms Press and A Child is Being Killed from Aqueous Books. Her fiction, poetry, and essays have appeared widely in such publications as The Washington Post, Denver Quarterly, The Rumpus, West Branch, Pink, Huffington Post, Everyday Feminism, among others. She holds an MFA from Naropa University's Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics, and she is a volunteer death doula. Welcome, Carolyn.
Hi. So I'm just going to read a short-ish poem from one of my unpublished poetry manuscripts. So here we go. It's called Dispatch. Eternity gets filtered through a grave, then the ghosts won't challenge us no more. They say we always tried to tell the truth. They say we caught you gently as you sank. They say we held you quietly with love. They say, repeat me, repeat me. Eternity gets filtered through a grain. Now you'll never be alone again. The width of you is to be bravely filled. All it takes is one glimpse of this bowl. All it takes is one glimpse of this stem. This grain, when attended to, creates you, completes you against odds and advice. Eternity gets filtered through an eye. For just one moment I know you again. Weeping I shall drench your head in rain. Wash away your death with April floods. Watch your memory rise brave like a flame. Warn you not to drown between your dreams and that proud space of tellings of your dreams. Eternity gets filtered through a dream that knows itself whenever it's alone. I'm your ghost as much as you are mine. We're such real timeless packets of each other. This fact is as solid as my palm. This fact is as righteous as our dream. Eternity gets filtered through a wave. I'm never gonna go downstream again. Time to go haunt history like it haunts you. Time for active loathing of this dust. Time to tame it till it lets you rise. Straight through a lifetime's worth of dust I'll take you, till you and history see each other rightly in the sun. Eternity gets filtered through a well. Watery ghosts of words ring crudely out. At the edge of language and its silent burials, the echoes of a past we tried to tell. Clutch their drops so we don't drown again. Clutch their drops till bodies manifest. Eternity gets filtered through a pyre that lights itself whenever ghosts get old. No, I'm not ever gonna starve again. I see your molten life and raise you mine. Now you'll never die in view of birds. Now you'll never die because of men. Eternity gets filtered through a stain. I'm not gonna fret about stains no more. In my heart 100 stains of you repeat. I'll hold them close whenever I'm alone. I'll hold them close whenever I am born. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. I really do love that one of yours. I've heard it a few times, but yeah, it's just as good.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I believe that was everyone read from something in progress. So if anyone, I think there was someone asking for links to books, but hopefully there, well, actually, Carolyn, your poem does appear somewhere, right? So it's in, I think it's in diagram.
Oh, I can find that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'll drop the link in the chat at some point. But Dorian and Kate, I think those are your in progress works, which we are so excited for and can't wait to read when they're out. So the purpose of this panel is to discuss stuff around writing, the challenges, the processes, the craft, ideas around writing long form work, which is not that different from writing work of any length, except that there's kind of a sustain factor in writing long form work, and it can obviously be harder in a lot of ways. So let's start by just going around very quickly, and can you tell me in just a sentence or two what you're currently working on and what your current normal process looks like? Is it daily, weekly, monthly? Is it how does it work in your life? So let's start with Dorian and then go Dorian, Kate, Carolyn.
Okay. Well, I suppose in the last few years, largely what I've been working on is essays, so shorter pieces, or fragments, that could become either essays, they could grow into essays, or they could find their place, kind of like the piece I read, that a fragment or piece that might find its place in a larger, book-length memoir. So I've really been just taking it piece by piece, with the intention that the essays could add up to a collection, a book-length collection that's linked. I write personal essays, so there's a lot of recurring characters and recurring motifs in them. Yeah, so I've just been working at it piece by piece. My daily, or it's more of a weekly process. I don't know that I get to the computer and write and generate every day, but I would say that my process is more weekly. I try to carve out at least some time. It's not necessarily regular every morning or every evening, but at least a few times a week, I try to carve out at least a few hours to attend to my own work, to just make sure I'm kind of feeding that part of myself amidst everything else. So I'd call it more organic, my process.
Yeah, I relate a lot of that, Dorian. I'm working on a novel, and it's very close to the end of the first draft, but this draft I've been in it for like 3.5 years. So I got very serious about the writing of this book, like I would say a couple months before COVID. So it's been a little bit of a long haul. And for most of the book, I was doing like a once or twice a week kind of tending to the manuscript, and around the edges, I would do a lot of just like imagining. I'm hesitant to call it planning because it's not like I was using an outline or anything, but in the beginning stages, that just felt like I needed to make a lot of decisions in my own mind before I could come to the page and get any work done. I'm not really the kind of writer that figures things out as I'm writing. But now I would say about a month ago, I, for the first time, could really envision the resolution of all the arcs that I started. Like the ending is now kind of available to my imagination, and I'm eager to get there. And I have been lucky to have a little space in my work schedule for the last month or two where I have been in the manuscript most days. But, you know, not more than an hour. I usually can, like at this stage when I can envision things, I can get through like 1,000 words in about an hour. But in the earlier stages of the book, it would be like an hour would give me like 300 words or so it has really become changeable depending on where I am in the draft. So right now, a lot of output for me, which is really cool, but not usual for me.
My turn. Yeah, thanks, guys. Not so dissimilar from some of the things Dorian and Kate just said. So I try to keep my hands in a lot of different projects, however big or small. That helps me. It helps me when I feel like I'm lagging or disconnected. I just kind of am like, all right, I'm gonna pick one. Just gonna pick a thing. So I have a poetry manuscript that I kind of accidentally wrote in a notebook during the pandemic, which I'd been getting down on myself for, I haven't been writing. And then I realized, no, I have a more than a poetry manuscript in this notebook that I would just sit with while I was watching TV or write in before I went to bed. I'm a really big fan of notebook practice, I call it. Just writing lists and observations, charts, drawings, random poems and thoughts, just in a notebook. And some very cool things have happened for me. And it feels lower stakes than some other types of writing that I do. But yeah, so that's something I've been transcribing and playing with. I've been writing a lot of short stories, actually. Again, with not necessarily with the goal of putting a book together, but then I realized, oh gosh, I think I'm like getting towards having a short story collection. This is really cool. I was never planning on doing that. My writing process is kind of like that. I don't over plan. I've been writing since I was 5 years old and have learned that I always come back to it. So that's been a relief as I've gotten older, just the like not just sinking into the more kind of dormant magical part of it, the things the roots do underneath the dirt before you get the plants kind of a thing. That's a really important mindset for me, and it takes off a lot of pressure. So I certainly don't write every day. These days I kind of tell myself to do 1 or 2 writing related days a week. And I kind of hold it a little loosely. I'll just work on kind of anything. And if I'm really stuck, I'll work on submissions or rereading things to kind of plant some seeds around things I've already written and coming back to it later. Or I'll have a Zoom group, a really casual kind of writing buddy Zoom group type of thing. I also have basically a solidarity buddy, an accountability buddy. My friend and I text each other once a week or so to check in, which is something we do in the manuscript groups. And I find it just useful to just talk about it with her. So those are some of the things that I like to have a few different tools to bring in, and to kind of assess if I'm so stressed that I've been feeling disconnected from writing for months. I usually try to assess, okay, I think something else is going on here, like a pandemic or a family problem or a health problem. And I try to kind of massage that a little bit, because it's often psychological stuff and just stress in life that gets in the way. But yeah, that's pretty much my writing process.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up mindsets, because that's actually something I want to ask you all toward the after we talk a little bit more, but I want to ask about later about like what helpful mindsets for writing book length things or sustaining the work. And also just a quick reminder, if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. As I see them come in, I will incorporate them into our discussion. And I'll just share quickly too about my process in case that's helpful. But so I do have what I try to do, and this is solely because it works best for me, but is I do try to make writing a thing that I do in some small way, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, but every day, only because that mindset, that is something that really helps my psychological existence beyond writing too, just to kind of work that muscle in some form. Sometimes it's reading over something from a previous writing session and just like changing a word, or like not even changing anything, just engaging in some way with it. And sometimes it's much more generative and fruitful and I write much longer. But I similarly have like, yeah, things come up in life and that wrenches get thrown into that at times too. But that's sort of my mindset that I try to stick to. And for the most part, I am fairly good about doing that in some form every day. And then sometimes there's it's the non-writing times that actually is the big breakthrough in any process. So it's like going for a run and having an idea to something that you've been struggling with kind of pop in, and you kind of realize that the writing process is this amorphous thing that is not just when you're at the desk, but like our brains are always sort of trying to figure out the thing that is on our mind the most, which is often like our big writing project. So that's a little bit about how I approach things. Let me turn to something that I'm really curious about, how you guys see this. But so obstacles and hurdles that have come up in your own work, particularly with longer book length stuff. What would you say has been like the biggest challenge for you in your own work? What does it seem to be in your experience for yourself and for your students? So again, let's just stick to that order of Dorian, Kate, Carolyn, unless anyone has something really urgent.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I would say one hurdle when working on a long sustained project, at least in my experience, is sort of trusting, or having faith that the pieces that you're writing every day or every week or every month are actually going to cohere eventually into into a manuscript that hangs together. And I know I feel that way often, and I've seen it in courses as well, where people are working, or programs where people are working on long projects, and it's a long game, right? It takes usually at least a year, often longer than that, to get a manuscript generated into some kind of shape. So my feeling is, and what I advise people to do is to just take it piece by piece, and Anne Lamott's famous bird by bird advice, I think it gets thrown around a lot, but I think it is actually really helpful and true that to write whatever we're writing in the moment, if we're writing a scene or a fragment or focusing in on a certain memory, you have to kind of fully devote yourself to that memory or to that piece, to render it as well as you can. And if you're trying to hold the whole superstructure of the book in your head, or try to figure out these big picture problems as you're doing that, it can become very overwhelming. So, I just kind of advise people to keep writing those pieces, and eventually you'll be able to spread them out in front of you and start to see the connections between them and how you might organize them. But that said, it's not that planning isn't helpful. I think outlining and planning can be helpful. But usually an outline will morph and change necessarily throughout the process, at least in my experience.
Yeah.
Similarly, I mean, in a simple way, I can say like the biggest obstacle is me. And I think that that's true with a lot of my students too. But what I mean by that is sometimes I get into these patterns of having expectations about my work that belong to someone else, that are not really about the work, but it's about like thinking that it needs to be done within a certain window of time, or thinking that I'm supposed to work within a certain process. You know, for a long time, I was really hung up on, like, I don't write every day, so that means I'm not really working on a novel. I don't know what that meant to me. And now most days I do write, and it doesn't really feel much different. It just sort of feels like the novel is telling me, like, it's time to be in there every day, like it's ready for that. So I think that I see like a through line in myself and my students sometimes of like asking the outside rather than the inside about how to do the book, you know, like it's like, or sort of writing the book for other people's expectations before I meet my own, or not, like when the idea is just a baby idea, it feels like too soon to be wondering who else is going to like it when I don't even really know what it is. And I think that pressure is really real. I talk about this a lot, that like, I think in the writing world, there's this kind of weird cultural relationship to writing, which is like, either you can do it or you can't. And if it doesn't come out of you in a like perfect in the first pass, then that can be really devastating. And I think about this concept a lot, and that still happens to me. It still happens to me. Like, I read something I just wrote and I'm like, oh, I hate that. And then I'm like devastated. But I think it's like I'm writing toward the wrong goal. Like, and I'm writing to figure out what the story is. I'm not trying to like, you know, like birth the story in its full form by, you know, like on the first pass. So I think sometimes having expectations that are created by other people and not by yourself can be a real hurdle, if that makes sense to folks.
It's so easy to get caught up in the external aspects of it. And I think that really, it leads people astray much quicker.
Totally. And I feel like it takes you out of the present moment of the writing. Like I feel like I'm like a hair's breadth away from writing the end. And my mind already is like, okay, well, now you have to you have to hurry up and rewrite the first chapter and make all these changes and revision. But I feel like I just have to rein myself into like, what is the work right in front of me? And that's really hard to do sometimes.
Last thing I'll say too is all that other stuff usually comes. It comes more, it does sort of come, and it will come when things are really, when you're ready for them to come. I know that is a frustrating view because it works differently for every person, but I do think there is sort of a natural way and place when that stuff kind of enters in. So Carolyn, turn it over to you about challenges.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, you know, a version of what you all just said. There's two things really come to mind when I think about my own and my students' most common struggle is just life being really difficult. And I just want to name that. You know, pandemic, kids, work, chronic illness, race, class, like you name it, you know. I want to acknowledge that we live in a context and it's really, really difficult. Sometimes there's so much suffering and so much just tiredness. And that's another conversation. But I think it's important to acknowledge that's probably honestly the biggest one for me and for all my students. And I don't know if there's anything to do other than just like witness it and like hold each other and ourselves compassionately around that and try to troubleshoot if at all possible. The second thing, which is more, I'll pull it down to the ground a little bit. Yeah, there's an issue around sort of, I guess we could say patience, or sort of I do feel like there isn't a realistic attitude towards the process sometimes. For my students and for me too, and for my friends who, we all know this, but we like give in to this idea anyway of product. Like we're obsessed with product for a lot of reasons. And I like to really just bring it back down to the process. There has to be a reason other than publishing to write. And I don't mean that publishing is not a good goal, because it's completely fine. It's not egotistical to have that goal. I have that goal. We have that goal. But it can't be the only goal, because writing takes a really long time. And to be good at writing, you have to really care. It's like having a child. I mean, maybe not as high stakes as having a child, but metaphorically, growing a garden, I'll say, you know, writing is not an algebra equation. It's sort of like an art, or it's like growing a garden where we plant seeds and we sort of very patiently turn things over and we give the ingredients, the sun, the, you know, a certain type of water or fertilizer. If something's not working, we kind of check it out gently. You can't be aggressive. It doesn't work that way. Or like raising a puppy, and you're trying to get the puppy to sit. It's like, okay, honey, like just stay. And 100 times, you just have to bring the puppy back really gently. Just stay with the process. Just stay. It's like in Buddhism, like monkey mind or like puppy mind. You have to treat yourself that way. And I know how excruciating it can feel because we're not used to being gentle with ourselves mentally. But I've come to see that it really is just true. Like it's the truth of creativity. You have to be gentle with yourself, and it's so hard, and it's such a good practice. Because when people don't kind of get their hands really excitedly in the process and in the mud, they drive themselves crazy and it makes them hate themselves. They overthink, they get stressed, often they give up, or often the product just doesn't end up being that good. You don't want to rush baby rearing. Like you don't just get to have an 18-year-old who's going to Harvard. You have to do a whole lot of other stuff before that. So such is writing and every art. And I just try to invite myself and other people to be like, to love that and to find the reasons for writing that aren't product. Maybe it's passionate about a topic, maybe it's healing, maybe it's just like real like open-ended wide-eyed curiosity or obsession about something. Maybe it's community. It doesn't have to be like toxic positivity, like I'm having fun writing all the time, because that's not realistic. But some motivation to be able to stay in the process, some drive that isn't, I guess, external in a sense, like maybe Kate was saying a little bit.
I guess that nicely leads us into the next thing I wanted to ask, which is, what do you find sustains you in your process of working on long form work and working on a book? What is it that is driving you? What kind of keeps you going? And also, like, what is at the heart of what you feel this work is for you? I guess we can keep Dorian, Kate, Carolyn.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I really appreciated and loved what you said, Caroline, and also Kate too. I think some of what you said kind of synced up. But yeah, I mean, I think there can be impatience because we live in this capitalist marketplace, and people want to get the book done and they want to figure out how they're going to sell the book, or get their agent. But I would just kind of suggest that, like, your book, you know, or whatever you're working on, your art doesn't want to come into the world in order to market itself, right? I think it wants to come into the world because it wants to come into the world and be the truest version of itself, right? And so so keeping that in mind, I find helpful, because we do have all these pressures on us to think about, well, why are we spending all this time alone in a room, you know, for a year or two writing this book? What's going to come of this? But trying to kind of lean into the process for its own sake, and because you're truly interested and invested in what you're exploring in your project. So that is actually one thing that keeps me motivated, is just you know, is gravitating toward or choosing projects that I really cared deeply about, where I'm curious about the material. I want to discover the material by sticking with it and by writing about it and exploring it over months and months and months. But I think, you know, we also need, most of us, I think, probably need community around us, you know, to help us stay both motivated and accountable. So, you know, I find being in a writing group is really helpful, you know, where I have, you know, either loose deadlines, or at least I know people are waiting to kind of read my pages, and then we can have a conversation about what I'm generating. And even if I'm kind of at a point where I'm sick of the material or getting a little bit stuck or discouraged, sometimes those conversations that I have with other people who are familiar with the material and might themselves get a little bit excited about what I'm doing, you know, can inject new life into my process, or at least remind me why I'm pursuing that material in the first place. So I think we need people around us as we're kind of sometimes slogging through these these long projects that we care deeply about, but inevitably they're going to be dips and crests in that process and in our motivation.
Yeah, I relate a lot to a lot of that, Dorian. And I would say the primary thing that keeps me in the project is that it's an intellectually satisfying exercise for me to do. I think oftentimes I've had folks tell me like, oh, writing should be joyful, right? And writing is sometimes joyful, but writing is also sometimes stressful, and it's sometimes like a deeply difficult but satisfying puzzle to solve. And I actually like the process of writing because it offers a dynamic emotional experience, and that it doesn't always feel joyful. It doesn't always feel any sort of way. But I do feel like it's a good use of my time. And I write about things that I have curiosity about and that I am borderline obsessed with, that I want to examine. And I've never envisioned a version of myself that didn't write. It just feels kind of like a part of who I am. But I think that feeling doesn't have to be true for anybody to be a writer. I just feel lucky that that's how I feel doing it, that I've found a thing that makes me feel that way. But also with the long-term projects, I sort of got to a point when I started writing the novel, I had this fear that I wouldn't be able to pull it off, right? That the scope of the project would feel too big. I wouldn't be able to wrangle the story. I would never be able to see it fully for what it is, or that I wasn't up for the challenge of the novel. And then once I put in a year and a half, 2 years of work, I just was like, well, I either think that I wasted all of that time or I finish it. And now the finishing feels like I have to honor that time that I've spent and get to what feels like the end for me. So those are the two things that kind of keep me in it, and also admittedly there are like professional stakes for me too in finishing the book, and that's not nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I completely love the way you guys just framed all that. I guess two major things come to mind. The first one, community. It always seems to come back to that in some way. For me and for most of the people I work with, and there's so many ways, a real long, intensive commitment in like one of our manuscript groups or a short class or free communities, free writing groups, writing with a friend, all kinds of really neat things that happen at libraries, going to support others in community at readings and stuff like that. That's something, whether it's active writing in community for me or I guess supporting others or like kind of being interested in others' work, some way of keeping the mental and emotional connection to others who write. I just feel that's the thing I hear the most. I'll say that's the thing I hear the most from my students, and they worry the most at the end of a class. It's always like, oh, how, gosh, like this was so useful for community. We almost always do a brainstorming exercise around, okay, like, let's do it then. Like like write like 20 things in the chat around an idea for community. So that's big. And then, yeah, I guess going back to the beginning, like kind of Dorian was reiterating about the process. Loving the process, getting your intellectual hands in it, like Kate was talking about. For me, there's often, I'll just get cheesy with it, like it's magic. I find the creative process really weird and magical and strange. And I would use the word spiritual for myself, but that doesn't that's not everybody loves that word, but that like alchemical, there's something about there's things you do really actively to write, and there's like a sense of I and self in there, and like methods and things to do. And then there's this other part of it that just like, whoa, wait, what just happened? And it's so cool. And sometimes the lab blows up, and sometimes you get to be the mad scientist who discovers a thing, or there's something that doesn't make logical sense to me about the creative process. And because, I grew up in this dominant American paradigm where, we learn a lot about the frontal lobe part of the logical part of the process, and it's super valuable. But coming back around, like empowering myself to just be this like wide-eyed like magician who's like, I'm gonna do that thing and see what happens, and I'm gonna do this thing and see what happens, and not be afraid to blow up the lab or to like get really muddy and gross and sad and then just do this dance and something. Yeah, I am gonna keep using the word magical, you guys. Like I'm going there. Like something really cool happens that is not, I don't know how to explain it. And the more that happens to me, the more I feel like I can lean back a little bit more and like kind of conceive of myself as sort of somebody who like a little, like the TV antenna, like someone who's just receiving in a curious way, and maybe even like channeling things that I don't even know how they're being created, or there's something other than me in there. That's helpful. That's really helpful for me.
I know exactly what you're talking about. And I actually, and when I look at, to share a little bit of my process, say me of 10 years ago or 15 years ago when I was an undergrad or like the MFA program versus now, there is a sort of relaxing into, now I feel like there's this sort of following of whatever kind of comes up, kind of like what you're talking about, Carolyn. And it's a really exciting process. And sometimes it brings up things that feel ridiculous or silly or weird or bad, like bad ideas. But in learning, I think that for me, the thing that sustains me is just trusting this process, trusting that in following what arises, not all of it will turn into a story that I am working on seriously and want to try to send out into the world, but it's all kind of part of this like this trail that you're following, and it might lead somewhere really exciting. So that's really exciting to me. So I really resonate with what you said. I also want to just say that another helpful mindset that I think can sustain people, and I've heard other authors talk about this, is imagining who might your ideal reader be, or who are you writing for? It might be someone in your family. It might be your family. It might be someone who who really gets your work, really loves your what you write, or people of a certain experience. So, and I think it can be really helpful rather than just to sort of feel this, to kind of visualize this like massive, you can't even picture who your audience would be, but to be like, well, who am I really, like, this is assuming you have a desire to tell stories to people, or tell some, because you can also just write for yourself, and it doesn't need to even need an audience. But I think that a lot of us come to writing with a sense of an audience. So I think kind of envisioning who your audience might be, separate from the big goals of publication, but just like, what do you want to say to a certain person or a certain group of people? And for me, it's really helpful to think of my partner, who I read stuff to him when I'm working on it. He helps a lot in the editing process, but he's also just a really good reader of my work. And it always makes me feel like, well, he really gets something about what I'm trying to say. And that inspires me and makes me want to write more for that. So when my work is at its best, he, more than anyone else, sees that. And so like to find that person maybe who gets the thing that you're trying to do and share with them you can even just talk to them about what you're working on. And I do think that creates excitement and energy and sort of a positive momentum around it. I want to go to some of the questions in the chat that have popped up. So I will try to get through all of them, but and we might not all need to answer all of these, just in the interest of time, but whoever has an urgent answer to these questions, feel free to chime in. So someone asks, how do you know when feedback is helpful or hurtful to your work in progress? Such a good question. So like, when do you let other people read your work? How do you know they are the right beta readers for you? Ooh, that's a big one. How do we know, and how do you navigate? What's your sort of 2 cents on feedback?
I actually have some pretty strict rules for myself around this one. There's basically 2 rules that I give to myself. I'm lucky in my life to be surrounded by kind of writing peers, a lot of whom are also teachers. So I pick beta readers who I know that I can trust them. I know that they can give me really useful advice, and I know that they're not jerks who are going to make me feel super crappy about my writing. I know they're not going to be like, if I give it to my mom, she's going to be like, oh, great, honey, you're so smart. But that's sweet, but not useful. But if I give it to, say, Kate, such useful feedback and compassionate and wants to meet my piece where it's at. I always have a little bit of a red flag around if somebody's trying to get not curious about, it's like, oh, you're writing a book about vampires. I kind of think you should write it about werewolves, though. And it's like, no, they're not saying, oh, let's get this to be the best vampire book it can be, right? So someone needs to be able to meet you where it's at, or else it's a little. And then my other quick kind of formula is if I'm in a group or something and like 2 or 3 people give me the same piece of feedback, I'm usually like, okay, that's like a pretty good indicator that I should probably follow that basic feedback. If the feedback's all over the place, I just, revert to my gut. And if I get a whole bunch of total crap feedback, I might ask different people who are more kindred spirits, or I might just have to have a conversation with myself about what's happening.
I have a lot of thoughts about feedback, and I will keep it fast. So for one thing that I think is really important is to be, for me, and for, I've seen this in students of mine, is like to be really clear about why you want feedback. And I think there are a lot of reasons. So anyone that I've shared portions of my novel, I know that I'm not ready for small picture critical feedback. It is not helpful for me for somebody to look at a chapter and say, I think the scene summary balance here isn't really working. Because what I'm after in this draft is like sussing out plot and trying to figure out who my characters are. So if I'm showing it to somebody, I want to know things like, what do you think might happen next? Where do you feel interested? What is your general impression of what's going on? And then if I'm, on the flip side, if I'm closer to the end and I feel like I'm reading something over and over again and it's not quite feeling like it's working and I'm not sure why, then I'll ask for that sort of like more focused mechanical feedback. So I think like a big piece of advice I have is like, driving the bus of asking for feedback. I think we often approach feedback as sort of like, here it is, do your worst, right? And it's like, if you ask specifically for what you need, almost everybody will meet you there. And the second thing is I've gotten really thoughtful about what it means to be hurt by feedback, or what happens with me when I have a negative reaction. And what happens to me is one of 2 things. The first and the most common is that the feedback is hitting at a problem that I have not yet figured out how to solve. So somebody might name like, I don't think there's a lot of tension in this scene, and I don't totally believe that this is what the characters would say to each other. And if I have a big flare reaction, usually my subconscious thought is like, fine, but what am I supposed to do about it? Right. It like comes from this like really like defensive place. And that's actually easy to work with when that comes up. Like when I'm like, oh, cool, I'm actually just really worried about that part. And they're like hitting on a piece that's vulnerable, and they're actually supporting my initial thought, which is that it doesn't quite work. And so when I can calm down, then I say like, okay, the move is to write that scene 5 different ways. You just be open to any way that it could go, and then eventually you'll pick one. But I think that's like a way that you can neutralize, like, is the bad reaction because you don't feel up for the challenge or you feel worried or something? And then the other time I have a bad reaction to feedback is just when people are mean. And like that becomes pretty clear, right away. Like, you can't go to the next step of like, oh, well, are they actually right? And should I, is this really just tapping into an insecurity of mine or whatever? But like you'll know if someone is crossing a boundary. And usually that looks like the feedback is vague and has a value judgment. Like, I think this is bad, right? It's never useful to just say it's bad. So yeah, those are sort of my random thoughts about asking and receiving feedback.
Thanks. Yeah, and then like in terms of the when to seek it, I would say, to answer the person's question, I my rule for myself as to when I personally seek it is I have taken the piece as far as I possibly can. That's I don't know, like to me it reads as like it's ready to be sent out to a journal. So like I think feedback is most helpful when you look at the piece and there's nothing you're seeing that is sort of provoking you to want to change something. I mean, you could also be in another camp where you're like, there's something is not working and you really don't know what to do. And so you're just at this point, you're giving it up to a first reader. But I do think I get the most out when I have taken it as far as I can. I've taken some space between, because you don't want to send something for honest feedback to someone and you're in this celebration mode about the piece and you can't really receive what comes in the best mindset. So I always wait before I send it off, and I legitimately at that point want to know what can I make better before I send this to its next place. All right, so yeah, that's let's go to the next question. All of these questions, there could be like a whole thing that we talk about. All right, so Carla asks, any advice for returning to a book project that has been put away for several years? I'll just quickly say, because this actually just happened to me. Basically, I had tabled a novel project for a couple of years, working on another one, and this other one just kind of came back. And for me, it came back because certain stuff happening with certain family members, and just something felt urgent about it. It kind of came up, it became an outlet for sort of exploring certain things, and it felt a lot more urgent. So I would say my advice would be like, why is it coming back? If there's something that feels energized and urgent about it, I would say go follow that. And similarly, don't force it if it doesn't feel that way. If you're returning to it just because you think I should return to this and I should finish this before I go on to the next one, but you're kind of slogging through it, I would listen to the energy, to what feels exciting. I think that is always going to, I mean, like Kate said, though, it's not always going to be fun necessarily, but to what feels like it has some energy behind it. Because I think that will lead you to where there's urgency and where there's a sense of what you're deeply interested in exploring. So any other thoughts on that?
I have a lot of experience with this. I mean, I had this novel draft come back 15 years later and ask me to rewrite it, and I heeded the call. I mean, it's like what Joy said, you want to make sure you're not just like doing it because you don't know what else to do, but it was asking me to be a novel. And the first thing I did was I pulled up 2 documents, original one and the new document, and just literally rewrote it from scratch, looking back and forth, which sounds, I know how that sounds, but it was an incredibly powerful thing to have done. It became very obvious, like what was good, what I was really excited about. Some of it I cut all together, but a practical thing like that can help you get back in if you're really going to do something like that. And I really encourage it.
Yeah, I think you'll inevitably grow as a writer and as an artist in the meantime, however long it's been since you were working on that project. So I think it can be a really good thing for the work, to go back to a book if you're compelled to after, a year or 2 or 3 or more has passed. But I would just say, like, be willing to bring your current sensibility as a writer to that project, and not be like, well, at the time when I wrote this 3 years ago, I felt like I had this scene just perfect, exactly the way I wanted it. You've probably evolved since then. And so be just, to Carolyn's point, I think being open to rewriting, sometimes doing heavy rewriting of parts of that project. But I think that kind of gap can really allow you to come back with fresh eyes and see things you really weren't able to see when you left off with that project.
Totally. Yeah, no, yeah. And it often if it's calling you back, I would say that there's probably some big growth that has taken place in it too. So follow that. So Dorian mentioned, someone asked, Dorian mentioned a project going in its own unplanned directions as you are writing. How long a leash do you give that unexpected direction? How do you make a judgment that this direction is fruitful or a disjointed diversion? So yes, how do you manage that?
That's a really good question, and I think this actually relates. I noted that question when it came up in the chat. I thought it was really good and interesting to think about. And I think this sort of relates to something I believe Carolyn had said about, well, like the kind of magical or spiritual or mysterious parts of the writing process. I think another way of framing that is to think about how the subconscious gets into the process. So I think especially in the earlier stages when you're embarking on a long project, I would give yourself a fairly long leash, to allow for a lot of exploration. And, I sometimes frame it in terms of opening doors in the project, being willing to just, if you come across a door in the project, open the door, walk through it, see where it takes you. It may be a dead end, but it may not be, and it may lead the project in a really exciting and, fruitful direction that you weren't anticipating. So being open to that kind of surprise, I think, again, especially like in the early stages of the project where you're really discovering the material and discovering, what this book might become, is a good thing. And then, I would kind of tighten the leash as you get deeper and deeper into the process, as a way of focusing, kind of like focusing your efforts around the book, because eventually you're gonna, I think, begin to really get a deeper sense of like, well, this is what this book is about, maybe thematically, this is how I might really focus and rein in the narrative and streamline it. But that usually comes later on. So yeah, in the early stages, long leash, I would suggest.
Yeah. No, I'm with you on that.
Yeah, I think even if you're writing like in a direction that feels like a tangent, like you may reach a plot related dead end, but what you do will offer you something. You'll learn something about what you're up to. So I feel like the litmus for me is always like when I get bored. And I think also Dorian's like calling to theme, like sometimes I may like what the characters are up to, but I see that it's really straying far away from the bigger conversation I want the book to have. So then I'll call it before I'm bored. But I think valuing the diversion is a big part of the process, right? Like not even looking at it as a diversion, of just being like, okay, well, we'll do this for a bit.
How do you know when to stop editing? Someone asks, or how do you know when you've reached that final version stage? Or does this ever happen? I'll just say though that there are writers that like publish things and then they like it's public, and then it's sort of compiling that into a collection, and the piece evolves even more, and there's like some other changes. So in some ways, it might not ever reach that point. But you kind of have to make a decision at a certain point. Or for me, it really is when space is the biggest keyword for me in terms of knowing anything about when I can sort of take a break. Like just taking space from it will help you become your own best editor. It will sort of clear your judgment of your own work, and you'll become kind of a more objective reader for yourself. So take a month, take 2 months, take 6 months, just put it away for as long as you can. And when you come back to it, you'll really know a lot about, you'll see different things, and you'll sort of know there'll be a time when you come back to it when you don't actually see the same kinds of problems, when you're not as critical of it. And then maybe that's a sign that you're closer to that final version. That's my process, and that's how I do it. Other thoughts on that final?
I would, yeah, absolutely, the space thing. And again, that has to do with not rushing, right? But I think it was a student gave the metaphor, and I can't remember who it was, of learning how to shoot an arrow, like shooting it, you do your best, you get it in the right direction as much as you can, and then you let go, and there, you hope that you've maximized your chances of having it land in the place that you hope it lands. And that's different from something being done in the sense of like, okay, my cake is done, I can take it out of the oven now. And in some ways that's a little, I know how that can be tricky because there's an uncertainty principle. Like, I have gotten a lot out of accepting the fact that that's all I can do. And that each book or story or poem I ever write is inherently a handshake between me and the audience. Like, if there's 100 people who read it, that's 100 different poems. And in some ways that's terrifying. And in some ways it's pretty freeing. So this is just me, but when I've been able to kind of, I don't know, have that attitude more, it's a little more freeing. And I also will like ask myself like what my quality of heart is around when I think something's finished. And I know that's kind of a vague thing to say, but like sometimes I do get a sense of like, okay, like I've made this its best self, and now I'm sending it to college, and it's going to go interact with the world. And I love you, book. Like, go be you. So it's like raising, or again, tending a garden just to its best self, as opposed to like this black and white stopping point.
I love that. And you do learn a lot from that process too, of sending something out in the world. So like you might send something out and that response that you get or might tell you a lot, and then you might keep working on it. So it's not like a door has closed once you send it out. You can always kind of revisit it and change. And sometimes you'll get helpful feedback from a particular place that you submit it to. There's a question here for Dorian. Dorian, how do you transition from writing fragments to a whole? So I think it's something you mentioned. How do you go?
Yeah, well, I just tend to keep writing fragments and they start to become a whole. And it's not as though you're going to use all of them, or they're going to all belong in the larger structure of the book. But I think even at the outset, we need to approach our projects with some amount of intention. So I don't mean to suggest that I would just keep writing fragments and have no idea what type of book I'm writing or what the central relationships are in that story. And of course I'd have some sense of that. But in terms of, how page to page, scene to scene, chapter to chapter, it's all going to be pieced together into an arc. I try not to worry too much about that when I'm in the early stages of working on anything long. And this is what I suggest to writers in my classes too, is it just to be open. And then the more you write, the more the material I think starts to tell you things and suggests associations and thematic links, and suggests the different threads that are intertwining in the larger book length work. So I think it's like what you get back from the work that you've written starts to give you cues and clues as to how you might start to shape that material. It might start to cohere, if that makes sense. But of course, like giving it to other people, can also help you figure out some of those questions and alert you to connections that maybe you're not seeing, and themes you keep gravitating toward as you're writing.
Such good advice there. Just want to echo too one thing you said about the work kind of revealing stuff to you as you follow it. There's so much overlap between what you said, Dorian, and like Carolyn, you talking about the following. I think that there's this process, if you kind of follow, aware that you don't understand really what's going on in the piecing together of these longer works. But if you follow kind of what is there, and things will change. The picture will become bigger. Things will reveal themselves. Connections will reveal themselves with the space too. That something might come up and solve a problem that was on your mind for a while. And that sometimes happens when you take the space, or when you are okay with just not having an answer. So there's something like very spiritual or meditative about the process, about just like being okay with not having all the answers. I think that for me has been one of the biggest challenges with long form work, because I write a lot of short fiction. I'm very comfortable with flash fiction and short stories, but there's been a lot of struggle about just being like, okay, it's okay that I haven't solved or figured out or can't hold even the whole of this picture in my head. And the stuff will come up and sort of say, well, actually, why don't you try it this way? Or why don't you try this structure? And that happens only with kind of letting it just exist in its messy form. We should probably wrap up, but I want to let people share final tips or advice, or just kind of like a final word you have about this process, or about like staying motivated or getting unstuck, or just something that it feels really significant. So Kate, I'll go to you first.
I think the biggest takeaway I've learned from myself about the creative process, particularly in working out a long form, is that it's important. Like, the thing that makes me dead in the water in my writing is fear. And it's important to develop systems to manage the fear that comes up that is specific to you. And that might be like small fears, like, oh, you're like a little insecure about how good the work is, or if you can pull it off, or like you have big fear about like mining a difficult emotional topic, or and I think that it feels important to me, and has felt important to my students, to develop a system to manage the scope of the big project that works for you. So if writing in pieces and waiting to discover what it is later is something that feels like it works for you, do that. If outlining in a like super meticulous way before you sit down to write like eases the fear of like not knowing what you're writing toward, like absolutely do that. You may not even stick to the outline, but sometimes making the outline in itself can be soothing, right? And like bring you to a space where like that magic that Carolyn is pointing to becomes available to you. Because if you're all locked up with worry, it's really difficult to get to a place where anything can come out of you. So like my biggest piece of advice is like, try every system until you find one that allows you to get words on the page in a way where you feel that energy come up in yourself, that like we're all trying to talk about, but it's like hard to articulate because it's so like that.
Yeah, no, so such important words. Carolyn and Dorian, I'm going to you in a second. Just want to say that I put in the chat, because some people have messaged me, info on our 10-month manuscript program, where Kate, Carolyn, and Dorian teach and lead their separate sections of the program. So feel free to check. If you want to, you can RSVP at that link to our open house, which is virtual, free, and open to all. We'll be talking more about the details of what the program is at the open house, and you'll hear from the writers here, Kate, Carolyn, Dorian, about their particular approaches in their workshops. You can also read more about the program. I would say do read in depth as much of the info there. There's a lot, and it's important to know because it isn't a pretty rigorous commitment to be in a 10-month program. All right, so final words and advice, Carolyn, Dorian.
Yeah, I mean, be weird, be compassionate, be bold, be vulnerable and bold, be obsessed and present at the same time. You don't need permission. You don't need as much permission as you might have learned falsely that you do. You don't need permission to write what is asking to be written, or how it's asking to be written, or whatever process is asking to be had. You don't need certain types of permission that I would almost guarantee you have somehow learned that you need. Most of us have. So I guess that would be my overarching advice.
Yeah, it's good advice. Well, I think one thing, just it's kind of straightforward, but just in terms of like the day-to-day or week-to-week of sticking with a long writing project might be to just be willing to switch gears. So like if inevitably you're going to have moments where you feel a little bit stuck, or whatever piece of the puzzle you're working on doesn't seem to be working. So just be willing to switch it up. Just leap to another piece, in the arc of the story, and start working on that moment and writing it out, or try a prompt that might seem at first totally unrelated to your project and the direction it's prompting you, but at least it's getting you writing in a different direction, to sort of shake things up if things start to feel stale in your process. And then also, I mean, this was mentioned before, but I'll use George Saunders' phrase. He calls it the heroic subconscious. So just trust the heroic subconscious in your work, and know that there are things happening in your brain as you're creating whatever it is you're creating that you don't necessarily have full control over, and that's a good thing. So it's just about being open to those forces, and kind of bending a listening ear at times toward those forces and sort of clues within the work that are guiding it toward what it needs to be.
Yeah, love that. Love George Saunders. He has such good wisdom on process and all of this. So thank you all so much for coming. I think we'll stop now because we have gone over a bit, and I hope to see you. I hope if you're interested in our program, on our 10-month manuscript program, you can come to our virtual November 20th, I believe is the date. November 20th open house. You can RSVP at the link I shared, or just on our website, pioneervalleywriters.org or .com. And thank you so much for joining in. Such great questions. Thank you everyone who asked a question, and thank you all for listening. And thank you, Carolyn, Kate, and Dorian, for sharing so much valuable stuff. It's so much to be said about this process, and we could keep talking about it, but I do think there's some comfort, and there's just something really uplifting and affirming to just know that we're all going through it together, and that everyone creative who's working on something struggles with these things. And it's kind of like life, right? There's all kinds of seasons and stages to a process like writing a book, and it happens through all that, and lulls and bursts of energy, and we're all kind of doing it at our own pace, in our own way. But thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of the evening.